Hey everybody, welcome to Conversation Piece with Patrick Armstrong. I am the titular Patrick, and this is a show where we talk about the missing pieces of the conversations that we're already having. Shout out to all of our returning listeners, and a high five and hello to everybody joining us for the very first time. Thank you so much. My guest today is a diversity, equity, inclusion, and justice consultant, anti-racist advocate, workshop facilitator, and content creator. He is also the founder of Critical Conversations Consulting. I am very honored, and it is my privilege to welcome Paul Lapido to the show. Hey, Paul, thank you for joining us.
Thanks for having me, Patrick.
Absolutely. For everybody out there listening and everybody out there watching, Paul and I connected on LinkedIn, and I was drawn to his content because he's very unapologetic about what he shares, specifically when it comes to this diversity, equity, inclusion conversation. He is, I feel like I've watched you, I talk about you like the second person. I feel like I've watched you, Paul, blow up in like a huge way, specifically on LinkedIn. It's been really, really incredible to watch people respond to your content and to watch you develop the language around what it is that you're sharing. So I'm really excited to be able to dive into this, and I really, really appreciate you giving some of your time to us today. For anybody who is listening who may not know who you are specifically, could you share a little bit more about yourself?
Sure. So, I have been doing DI work for about 10 plus years. And so one day I just decided to kind of strike out on my own because I love DEI, but I'm not a fan of 9-to-5 DEI, if that makes sense. And so in corporate structures, nonprofit structures, a lot of DEI is performative. And so smoke and mirrors. And so for me, like you said, I'm out there, I'm unapologetic. I'm raw, and I realized that, okay, as a disruptor, as we like to call it, like you kind of butt heads with people in high places. And so I thought, like, you know what? If I'm going to be me to myself, I'm just going to strike out on my own and be my own boss. So the rest is history.
I absolutely love that. Could you share a little bit about how you found yourself saying, when you first recognized, okay, corporate DEI is performative, or a lot of times it can be performative, so I want to go in this different direction?
I've been on LinkedIn since maybe 2012, on and off, and so I didn't comment for long. I didn't post or comment for the longest time. I was just really looking for jobs or whatnot and connecting with old schoolmates and coworkers. And so around the time the pandemic started, I was on there a lot more, and so I was looking for leads for new DEI jobs, and I followed people, and then people started talking about DEI. They weren't just looking for jobs, but they were talking about the nature of diversity, equity, and inclusion. And after George Floyd's murder, it increased. And so a lot of people, being a pandemic, a lot of DEI jobs were slashed. And then when George Floyd was murdered, they boomed, they opened up again. But a lot of people were saying, wait a minute, these companies are opening up, but they don't really want to invest in DEI. They don't want to tackle system racism. They just want somebody to shove in an office and say, look, we're diverse, we're progressive, and just seeing that unravel, I'm thinking, wow. But I still wanted to do DEI. So I was like, you know what? I'm already on LinkedIn. I'm going to use that platform to talk about issues that I see my colleagues and friends talking about. And so around that time, I started my own consulting gig. And I was like, okay, if I'm starting a business and LinkedIn is about connections, I want to use LinkedIn as a way to funnel people to my business. And so at the beginning of 2022, I started posting, and I just took it from there.
I love that it's so you've been on LinkedIn for a while,
yeah.
But it was really in I don't even know how to describe. People were calling 2020 like a racial reckoning, but I don't feel like that's not necessarily the best way to describe that. But a lot of folks, myself included, started to think differently, have different conversations in 2020. Right. And for you specifically, like you said, really start posting just in the last year. How has that changed over that year time? How has the conversation that you've had changed, or has it changed?
I don't know if it's changed, but I feel better because I'm doing my part. Because I don't know the best way to describe it is this: imagine you have something to say, whether it's to a friend, a significant other, or whatever. You got something on your chest, be a positive or negative, and you don't say it. That really eats at you. And so, and study after study says that when you bottle stuff up, you suffer for it. And so I was like, you know what? I don't know who I'm going to change or the world may change, but I'm not going to go to my deathbed thinking, wishing, I should have said something. Because that's one of life's top regrets. And so I read that years ago. And one of the top regrets was people not being true to themselves or not opening up about something they wanted to open up about. So I'm like, you know what? Strike while the iron's hot. We got something going on. I want to say something. I don't know who's going to affect, what kind of enemies I'll make. But you know what? I'm not going to be on my deathbed saying, "Well, I never stood up for anything." Well, yeah, I did. So
I absolutely love that. And I really appreciate you sharing that. And that's, again, one of the things that draws me and keeps me coming back to your work specifically is it is all of your conversation falls under this DEI umbrella, but it's not just one thing or another thing. Like, you really try and touch on so many different areas within within society, within the conversation itself. And that just leads you to be to talking about so many different things. And especially in this last year, as you've been on LinkedIn, as you've connected with other folks who operate in the same space and shared in these conversations, it's clear that, you're touching on a lot of different things and you're seeing a lot of different things. What is something that you feel like is either missing, as in the purpose of this particular show, or is just not being talked about enough that we really need to start focusing on a little bit more?
yeah, let's see. There's so many of them. Something that's not touched on enough. I think a lot of people don't understand the difference between prejudice and racism. And I think that, like, when people talk about DEI or anti-racism, like, oh, isn't this racist against white people? And it's like, well, I'm not gonna lie, there are people that have hostility towards white people, and there's anti-white. I work in an inner city store,
Mm.
and so I hear things that are not kind about white people, but it's like this: people don't or can't understand that, like, white people can be like, there's prejudice against white people, but white people are not oppressed. They're not like,
Mm.
they're not marginalized like black people, like Asian Americans, like
Sure.
people. So this idea that now white people are the new oppressed minority, it's a really gross misunderstanding of our experiences, and so it's like, I mean, I don't have the black people do not have the collective power to treat white people as second class citizens. We don't have that kind of social or collective or structural power, but yet they're like, oh, now this is racist against white people. I'm like, well, you're not like hearing that, but you're still like, to the eyes of many people of color, you still have that status, and so despite the prejudice that may be there from some people, it's like, yeah, you look at film, you look at beauty, you look at C-suite leadership, mostly white still. And
Yeah.
so, but a lot of people either they can or don't want to understand that. And so be it white or people of color, and so, yeah, so it's a tough pill to swallow, and I've written about that, and it did well, but I got quite a bit of pushback, and just people they don't want to hear that.
Yeah, I think that's a great framework. Is this misunderstanding? I like what you said. This gross misunderstanding of prejudice versus racism, that white folks feel that they are oppressed.
Right.
And for folks who might be listening, who especially white folks who might be listening who don't understand what oppression is, can you give us just that high level overview definition of what that means when
Yeah.
we are talking about oppression?
Yeah. So either undue hardship or being treated as a second class citizen. And I emphasize treated. Like, a lot of people say, well, aren't we all equal? And yes, we're all created equal. I'm not saying otherwise. What I'm saying is that, like, in terms of, okay, do you make less money? What is your housing situation like? Who gets to pass the laws that affect your eye? And so, like, I know in Florida, DeSantis, like, oh, he mandated teaching Asian American history, which is beautiful. But then in the same breath, he's like, oh, you can't teach Black history, but that sends a powerful message to both Black and Asian communities, And so, but like, Black people, Asian people, we don't have that kind of collective power here in the U.S. to make those laws, to make or break
Sure.
law. And so it's like, if people are passing laws that dictates who gets to teach our history and who doesn't, that says a lot, And so, yeah, the not only power to dictate, but also the power to divide and conquer. And I'm glad a lot of LinkedIn creators are called that out. Like, hey, that's not good. If you want to allow one, allow both. So
Right. I appreciate you said this a couple times. You talked about our lack of collective power,
yeah,
particularly from marginalized groups.
yes,
And I'm interested in, because I feel like, especially on LinkedIn, because it leans professional, but you see a lot of people, a lot of creators of color specifically,
mhm,
working together, having these types of conversation, and then generating these large followings. It feels like we are amassing power in certain spaces, but also, but it feels like there's a but there. It feels like with the power that we are amassing on a LinkedIn, maybe doesn't carry the same weight all the time as the power that we are trying to achieve. Can you talk a little bit more about what that, the difference between those two things and how we can rectify or use one to achieve the other?
Right. So some of the people that I'm either connected to or follow, they have 50, 100, 150,000 followers, and that's a lot. That is some social media clout right there in terms of the word out. You know, you got an army behind you, but you know, in the end, above us, like, so let's say if myself or Elizabeth Liba or Madison Butler, if we piss or tick the wrong people off, LinkedIn can kick us off the platform.
Sure.
And so yeah, we have some power, but you know, if enough people complain or report us, or if whoever's in the office at LinkedIn, they can kick us off the platform. I've seen people get kicked off the platform either temporarily or permanently. Like I remember one content creator, she was like, she got gung ho. She was like, "Oh man, LinkedIn, you're not gonna silence us. You can't stop us, and we're gonna file a lawsuit." And I'm thinking, "Shut up, please." And sure enough, she was at the beginning of this year. She was gone. I haven't seen her since. And so yeah, she had some power. She had a good following, but like she pushed the wrong buttons, and she's gone. And so
it's interesting because I just had a conversation the other day about how for adoptees specifically, when we are adopted transracially, like it's obviously transactional adoption, but then like that transaction doesn't stop. We can have our privilege pulled out from under us at any time. So while our proximity does allow us to have access to that privilege where some other folks might not, it still is like really precipitous that can go away at any time. Just like, you know, this creator on LinkedIn, you can amass a large following, you can generate your own power, but at the end of the day, that can still be taken away from you.
Yes.
How do we, so this is going to get into like our inside outside part of this conversation. How do we as creators of color, as people from historically marginalized groups, continue to amass maybe the social power, whatever it might be? How do we continue to assure that we are partaking in that conversation, talking about or at least appropriately defining oppression and what that means, and then calling out, you know, this prejudice versus racism conversation? How do we internally within our communities focus on that? What do we need to be focused on from our perspective to make sure that we're moving forward, and that when we collect power, we don't, if we for whatever reason lose it, we're still moving forward? Does that make sense?
It does. It does. I guess realizing that you're not alone. I think like whenever you go through either struggles or you have a vision for your life, it's very easy to become tunnel vision and think that you're alone or want to be alone, but realizing that this is a collective effort. Like I can't do this by myself. I don't want to do this by myself. I have no desire to be Superman, you know. And so like I love my LinkedIn community and followers and connections. It's like we're all in this together, regardless of your privilege or marginalized status. We're all in this together. And whoever's on my side, be it black, white, Asian, gay, straight, trans, whatever, you know, and if I were to die tomorrow or get kicked off the platform, at least I take solace knowing that I was able to get a following. And if I had to go to another platform, I'll do it again. It would suck and that'd take a lot of work, but you know, eventually rise back to the top, you know. And so, but just realizing that also, you know, you never know the impact you have on people. Some people will tell you something, and just because people don't tell you doesn't mean you haven't had an impact on people.
Sure.
Years ago, a classmate of mine, we were in grad school together for biology, and this class of mine, she was absolutely miserable, and I didn't know it at the time. And so, but every day I saw her in the hallway of the biology, but I said, "Hey, how you doing?" You know, and so, and I just said same thing, "Hey, how you doing?" every morning. And then one day she says, "Hey, you know, I've been really having a rough time in this program, but the fact that every day you said hello and greeted me, that made me feel so much better." And I never knew just saying hi to her every day made that big of a difference in her life. And so if you talking about racism or sexism or whatever marginalization you experience, whether it's 2 years or 5 years or whatever, it's like, don't underestimate the impact you have on other people, whether they're inside of your community or outside of your community.
I love that. And I appreciate you sharing that. I think it takes a long time for some of us to learn empathy in the way that we are exuding it and not realizing it, like that unconscious empathy.
Yeah.
And I feel like that's what that was. And that's what that is when you talk about that invisible impact on folks. It's that generally, if you are leaving that impact, you're probably interweaving empathy within, whatever you're saying or the interactions that you're having. I think it's really important to think about is that, okay, if we can reach that empathic point, it allows us to be more open to the conversation. Or when somebody's like, hey, 20 years down the line, all of those times you said hi to me really affected me. Like we could be like, oh, okay. And like it allows us to accept that compliment and be like, yes, let's continue to move forward. I want to stay on this beat for just a second because I want to go back and reference the content creator you said was removed from LinkedIn. So when it's obviously clearly not fair, and that's obviously a systemic issue for creators of color to have their platforms taken away. And like you said, you're seeing this happen and you're like, okay, I wish that you would kind of pull it back because we don't want to lose you from here as well. Do you have any advice about how we go about doing that? How we recognize, okay, maybe we're making, I don't want to say too much noise because I think we have to make the noise, but like, okay, we maybe need to take a step back and reevaluate how our approach here.
So I have a number of approaches. So one, when I make posts, 95% of the time I give a lot of thought before I post. So like any post I make, I've already thought about, I've ruminated it over days, weeks, in some cases months ahead of time. And so I write something, I edit it over plenty of times, and before I publish it, make sure I'm not angry or whatever moves it, because it'll come out into your audience. You may not think it will, but change a few words, and it'll come out and will come across more hostile, more somber, or whatever, And so another thing is, like, I'm going to say something unpopular. I don't like naming and shaming people. Like I do get in arguments with people, but I don't like, if somebody disagrees with me or somebody says something rude, I'm not going to be like, oh, look at Joe Blow. He doesn't believe systemic racism exists. Let's all make him feel welcome. And I'm like,
sure.
I don't do that. One, because we don't know all the information of what, we don't know the whole reason why they said that. We don't know all the reasons they said that. Because a lot of times I've had arguments with people, and once I get to know them in person, it's different. The stuff I'm missing. But then also retaliation, and so in some cases, the person or their friends retaliate. I know a number of Black women creators have said that white supremacists have shown up at their house, and so.
Oh wow.
Yeah, I don't want anybody showing up at my house because I have a wife and a son and another son on the way, and so.
Yeah.
That, but then also it's like, sometimes LinkedIn will see that as bullying. If you name and shame people, in some cases they take it down. Sometimes they won't, but in some cases they'll take it down depending on what you say and all that stuff. And so, and it's just like, and even tagging, some people tag LinkedIn in a post and say, well, LinkedIn, look what this person did. And I'm like, I don't know if I want to drag link. If they say something pure vitriol, like I've seen comments that were pure like MFF slur, fine, that's one thing. But it's like, I don't like to pull LinkedIn into my fights because I just don't want anything extra that may come of that. And so,
sure.
So you just got basically ensure you got to learn how to get some, like, you have to know how to pick your battles. There has to be some level of discernment there. So every battle's not worth fighting. So.
Sure. I appreciate two things. The one, talking about how even just a word change can change the tone, can change the way that your content is received. And then two, the context is so important for when somebody says something that we don't necessarily agree with. We can't react out of emotion. We want to react from a place of knowledge, from a place of understanding. And then just because we don't agree on that one thing doesn't necessarily mean that person's a bad person. So we shouldn't be putting them out in that way. We should at least be going maybe a DM. Maybe it's like, hey, I definitely did not agree with what you just said. I want to have this conversation. Can we talk about this a little bit? Are you open to that conversation? And that might end up being somebody that you can, again, extend that empathy to, and maybe somebody that you can work with on something else. And honestly, bring these two sides of the conversation together to have a more nuanced conversation.
It's funny you mentioned that, because yesterday I had a conversation with a guy that I argued with a while back. So I don't know if you remember back last September when Queen Elizabeth died. I made a post about that, and it did really well. And so and so I got all sorts of responses. I got people that thought it was balanced. Some people thought it was too harsh. Some people thought it was too nice on the Queen. This one guy, a man of color, starts talking about CRT and why is bad mouthing white people, and I was already feeling defensive because of all the trolls that showed up on the post, and so I kind of went off on him, and so that conversation ended. fast forward a few months, he pops up again. I recognize the name and the face. He pops on my post and he says something similar to what he said last time.
Mm.
I'm like, okay, I remember you. I was a little harsh. I'm sorry. I did not say that right. That just wasn't cool of me. I apologize. I said, hey, you built a connection. That's fine. Maybe we can learn from each other. And he goes, amen. And so he disappears. And so a week after that, I decided to just connect with him. Like, oh, yeah, I'll connect with this guy. Just whatever, you know. And so, and then like, he's like, and then once we connected, he started seeing more of my posts. And then he's like, hey, let's have a conversation. And so yesterday we finally talked. And then once I talked to him, like I knew this much, but then once I talked to him, I was like, oh, wait a minute. Okay. And so, but then like, yeah, I'm like, dude, I'm sorry. And you're a good guy. And I mean, he's more conservative than I am, but like he understands what you and I understand. He's just that his language is different because he's conservative and he's religious. And so, and I know that with religious communities, some of the language you use, you gotta change it. Like, so, and also he's worked these high level jobs where he's armed shoulder to shoulder with these high level 200K execs. And so he's like, yeah, using white supremacy is gonna like make them like shudder, you know? So yeah, it was just like, once I actually had a conversation with them, it's like the post was almost like from another person. It's like, that wasn't all of him, you know? And so what you said, like, yeah, I mean, just even yesterday, a conversation I had with a connection of mine. So
yeah, well, again, it's like that empathy part of it. It's like, okay, let me meet you halfway at least. And the fact that he reached out and said, let's have a conversation, and you were willing to say yes, because I know plenty of people, myself included, maybe sometimes that would say no to that
I was
opportunity.
Nervous. I was antsy like the whole morning before. I'm like, oh gosh, how's this gonna go? And pacing around my house, you know, and so I was like, no, I'm just going to call this guy. We're just going to get it done, you know.
But I mean, that's amazing, and I think that's a model for how. I mean, obviously a very small one person example, but I think it's a model for how we can approach these conversations a little bit differently than I think is maybe what's high profile right now in how we react to certain things. I've been talking a lot about on the show reacting from that place of knowledge, because I don't want to get caught up in emotion. That's how I used to respond to stuff. That's how I used to post. Like you said, you know, you'll sit on a post for months. And sometimes I'll sit on a post for about 10 minutes and firing that thing out there. And I'm like, wait a second. I like you said, I read the post and I'm like, okay, all of this right here sounds very upset. And I'm seeing that. I know other people are seeing that. So like, how can I do this a little bit differently? And it's like, well, one, I don't necessarily think I know what I'm talking about here. So let me sit down and like learn a little bit more, follow some people who are talking about this thing that I inserted myself into, and see if I can't have a better understanding. And that way, when something else happens in the future, I can react from that place of knowledge. And so I think that's, you know, something that I see being talked about more and happening more. But I also think because of specifically the political climate that we currently find ourselves in, reactions are what captures the attention of people, is this reactionary thought. And a lot of times the reactions are happening from folks outside of our community, specifically from white passing people. And so to kind of take a pivot and move to folks sitting outside of our community, you actually wrote a post today, and I want to dive into it because the very first line, I think it's a great thesis. Good white people benefit from racism and white privilege just as much as those who are unkind. And I think that's super important. And I think people see that and on its face are like, I'm offended now. But that's not the point. But that almost is kind of the point, is like, we're trying to get you to understand that this privilege that you carry extends beyond just the fact that, oh, I talk about anti-racism, or, oh, I'm an ally, quote unquote, to marginalized people. Can you talk a little bit more about how folks outside of marginalized identities and groups, what they need to do to make sure that they are understanding and not grossly misunderstanding what it means to be oppressed?
Okay, so I like this. I'm a fan of emotional intelligence. I mean, and I'm still growing in this area. But it's like, I think a lot of the problems stem from lack of emotional intelligence in this area. And so you pick up laws banning Black history or banning CRT or whatever, you know, it's like when you hear white privilege or white supremacy or CRT, these words that are like trigger words now, buzzwords, pay attention to your emotions. Like what emotions stir up and why? And I like to tell people, whether you're privileged or marginalized, you know, knowledgeable or not, pay attention to your emotions, ask why you feel those emotions, and ask what you can do to navigate out of that. And so, like, so if you feel dread, so let's say that you're a white person that's new to this, and you see my first that post or the first line, and dread wells up. I was like, okay, you feel dread. That's valid. It's a God given emotion, the sense of your world. Ask yourself, answer, why do I feel dread? Because I'm a firm believer that I'm responsible for what I say, not how you respond. If I'm not yelling slurs, if I'm not saying all white people are bad, if I'm not saying all men are dogs, or whatever, if I'm not saying those things and you still respond negatively, that's the issue. You gotta like you're something about you that's
Right.
processing this, and so ask yourself, why am I feeling this, and how can you navigate out of that? And so I would say that, and I would also just say challenge what you've been taught, because our parents, for the most part, our parents mean well, but our parents pass on biases and ignorance to their kids, and so people say, "Oh, my mom raised me to be colorblind." It's like, well, being colorblind is not necessarily a good thing. Your mom meant well, but in the process, she she taught you things that prevent you from looking at injustice. So think about your emotions. Think about what you were taught and how you were taught. Think about like have some humility, realizing that you don't share these experiences, and because you don't share these experiences, you should learn more. You should be slow to speak and quick to listen. I know that's taken out of scripture. I'm not proselytizing or anything, but it's like be slow to speak and quick to listen. But okay, if I don't know what it's like to be a woman. I don't know what it's like to be Asian. I don't know what it's like to be LGBTQ plus. So because of that, I like to like do more listening than talking, and I encourage you to do that.
I think I think that's one of the hardest things for people to really learn and understand. Like it made me think of listen to understand, not listen to respond, right. Essentially. Right.
Or listen to prove that you're right.
Exactly. I just literally had a conversation about like, it's not that we want to with someone. It's not like we're arguing and it's like, well, it feels like we want to both be right. And it's like, I don't necessarily think it's that we both want to be right. It's that we both are just not listening to each other. And we're just like trying to we're just shouting over each other. And that's why, because we're just not listening. Yeah. So like, let's take a step back and reevaluate this. I think those are three great things. Emotional intelligence is so important because it like you said, it's understanding that just because I feel something doesn't mean it's invalid, but also doesn't mean I have to project that feeling onto the person that's making me feel that way or whatever it might be. And then challenging what you've been taught is also very important. And then also that listening component, because I think each of those three things at its core identifies like the systemic issues that we all live with, particularly in this country, but I would say just in the world in general right now. And by understanding even those three different points, we can start to identify the systemic issues to where it doesn't matter where you come from, what background or identities that you hold. Like, yes, we all have these different experiences, but we realize, okay, we have the same goal of addressing and dismantling systemic inequity so that we all can find appropriate liberation and freedom and actual equity. And by doing that, we can understand that we don't all have to be the same or think the same or believe the exact same things. Knowing our end goal is the same allows us to then work across build coalitions, work across communities, across identities to build something that's mindful to all of these different people. Because a lot of times, like, especially I feel like in DEI work, it comes down to Black, white, Asian, Hispanic, Latina, whatever it might be. And then like now it's like, okay, there's some ability stuff in there. There's some LGBTQ plus stuff in there, but it really feels like it comes down to like a racial thing. We don't talk about the intersectionality of all those things.
No, we don't.
We aren't talking about how to be mindful of the intersectionalities of those things. And then you have somebody who is most likely carrying or in your corporation, in your organization that inhabits like 12 different identities, 12 different communities. How are we making sure that we are being mindful of all of that one person who inhabits all of these different things? And it requires us to make sure that we have emotional intelligence, that we're challenging the things that we grew up learning, and that we are listening to understand and not listening to respond. Right. So I think it's super important.
Yeah, I think also a good way to look at it is that like, don't think that it's so like being humble or if you're trying to be humble or trying to be woke or whatever, it's a lifelong journey. Or you're trying to be anti-racist, it's not like, and so like that person that has 12 identities, we don't know which ones they have. We don't know which ones are a priority. So like,
Right.
you take 5 Black people, these those 5 Black people, they have their Black identity may be all over the place. One could be number one, the other one could be number five,
Right.
and so one not every each group is not a monolith. So all Black people aren't monoliths, all women aren't monoliths. So within each
Yep.
group, there's different levels of privilege and marginalization. And just realize that, okay, on this journey to be anti-racist or inclusive or DEI, it's like this is a lifelong journey, and you're always learning. You're going to make mistakes, and just always look to improve. And it's something new, And so thinking that you have all the answers is the kiss of death. So thinking that one, that you don't have any biases, but also thinking that you have all the answers, those two are the kiss of death. So
I love that. Thinking you have all the answers is the kiss of death. That is amazing. I'm going to be using that a lot now. That is incredible. Paul, I really appreciate you sharing so much here. And I know like these conversations are a little bit shorter because we want to have that succinct, concise conversation about, these different missing pieces. I feel like we've touched on a ton of stuff, and I'm really excited to be able to share this with our audience because I feel like I've learned so much from you, and I continue to learn so much from you. And I'm excited to be able to share that with the people listening here or watching on YouTube. Who are you learning from right now?
I learned a lot from you. I mean, you have like I tell, I've been talking to people. It's like, I appreciate when men can emote, because men are taught not to emote.
Sure.
It's like you talk about being a transracial adoptee, you talk about your trauma, you talk about being Korean American in a white dominated society, and just like, you're just trying to like refine yourself, and you just keep at it, and you're unapologetic about it as well. And I learned a lot from you, and so like I'm actually at some point debating on tackling toxic masculinity, because I was a health educator for briefly, and so I waited for the right time and my own healing first, and then talk about like men, if I could be like another Fred Rogers or something,
Sure.
But I learned from you, and I learned from Madison Butler. I mean, she's unapologetically Black and queer, and she has a huge following, and she intentionally or unintentionally pushes those buttons, and so yeah, I'd say that.
Well, I really, really appreciate that. Yeah, I actually don't even know what to say. Thank you for saying that. I didn't know you were going to say me. So, Madison, too, incredible person. She just posted something today about we need to stop centering heteronormativity during Pride. 100%. And I was like, I read that. And I'm like, yeah, it definitely needs to happen. I'm like, I need to make sure I'm not doing that as well. Yeah. Madison is really incredible. And honestly, if you can support Madison, please do, because she always is calling out the trolls. I don't know if it was the name and shame, but she's not afraid to, like you said, push that button. Yeah. And people are constantly going at her. And, not only do we all need support, but especially those folks who are most visible and who put themselves in those places, we should be out there supporting them and making sure that they know they're not alone as they go through this fight.
There's nothing wrong. Like another colleague of mine, like she's opened up about anti-Semitism, and so I recently, like Lauren Howard.
Yeah.
So like I emailed her, and I was like, hey, you okay, sis? Just to say, hey, because she's been pretty transparent. She's like, thank you for doing that. So I would encourage you out there, if you're connected with somebody and you see they're going through a rough time, or they're vocal about whatever oppression, don't be shy about DMing them or email them and say, hey, you okay, sis? You okay, bro? You okay, sibling? Whatever. Just to, I don't know. We all got battles we're fighting, so we shouldn't be fighting them alone.
100%. And I can say that I know the last time we talked about a friend who was going through it and talking about that exact thing, reaching out and just say, hey, are you doing okay? Or what can I do to support you? Whatever that might be. So I really appreciate that about you, Paul. Just again, meeting folks with empathy and just showing them compassion and leading with that foot. Last question. How do our audience support you going forward?
Yeah, I mean, I'm on LinkedIn, and so if you want to just either follow me, connect me, or just look up. So on my profile, there's a link to my site, and so so on my site, it shows you what I do, and services I offer, and if you're interested, there's a contact form you can fill out, or you can just DM me directly and say, hey, I'd like to have a conversation. So yeah, so all my information is on my LinkedIn site, and check me out. If you're interested, hit me up.
Amazing. You heard it here first, folks. hit up Paul if you want to have these conversations. I know you've just learned a lot here in this 30 minutes, but there's so much more to be learned, so much more knowledge to be gained, and so many more conversations to be had. So, Paul, thank you so much for taking the time out of your day, out of the middle of the week, to sit down and have this conversation with me. It really, really means a lot.
No problem. Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. For folks out there listening, you can find links to some of the stuff that Paul and I talked about here in the show notes. And if you want to follow us, you can do so at Conversation Podpiece on Instagram. If you do feel inclined to leave a rating or review on whatever podcast player you're listening to this right now, we would greatly appreciate it. And if you're interested in supporting the show in the future in any way, feel free to hop in my DMs or reach out to me on my website, patrickintheworld.me. Until next time, I'm Patrick Armstrong, and this has been Conversation Piece. Thanks, Paul.